All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling something that on the surface might seem pretty straightforward, how to design and explain things for people who are, well, smart. But as we dig in, I think you'll see there's a real nuance to it, and sometimes getting it wrong is actually even more frustrating for a sharp mind than for anyone else.
You're absolutely right. There's this misconception that if someone's intelligent, they automatically have this high tolerance for like complexity or ambiguity. But oftentimes it's kind of the opposite. Really smart people, they value efficiency and they value clarity, right? Because they want to dedicate their brain power to the actual substance of what you're saying, not trying to decipher it.
Exactly. Like, why waste mental energy on a confusing explanation when you could be using that brain power to really engage with the ideas?
Yeah.
For this deep dive, our guide is Steve Krug and his book, Don't Make Me Think. Right. Now he's coming at it from the perspective of web usability, which, think of a website as just one kind of interface,
Yeah.
right? An interface for information. And the principles he lays out, the ones about making websites intuitive, they're so powerful when it comes to explaining anything to anyone, especially when you're dealing with people who are, really sharp and want to grasp things quickly, deeply.
That's exactly it, right? Our mission here is to pull out those core insights, those nuggets of wisdom from Krug that'll help you, our listener, communicate more effectively with intelligent people. It's all about respecting their intellect, right? Making
Well,
sure they're not having to waste time and energy on mental gymnastics just to understand what you're trying to say.
Right. It might seem almost too basic.
Right.
Just be clear. But I think as we unpack Krug's ideas, you'll find like these aha moments that'll refine how you approach communicating in all kinds of situations, especially when you know you've got a really astute audience. So where do we start with this?
Well, I think a crucial point that Krug makes, one that's so relevant when we're talking about explaining things to smart people, is the trap of overestimation. As creators, whether we're making websites or presentations or just, explaining a concept to someone, we tend to assume that our audience thinks the same way we do, that they have the same background knowledge,
Yeah,
right?
it's like the curse of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
We know something so well, we forget what it's like not to know it.
Yeah.
And we project that.
Exactly.
Even us, and we spend a lot of time on this material, we can still fall into that trap of using jargon or making references that might not land for everyone, even if they're super intelligent.
And this connects directly to this idea that Krug talks about, the myth of the average user.
Hmm.
Even when you're talking to a group of undeniably smart people, you have to remember that they're still individuals, right? Each person with their own background, their own experiences, their own way of thinking about the world.
Right. It's that reminder that intelligence doesn't equal homogeneity.
Exactly. What's crystal clear to one person, might require another person to pause and think for a second. We just can't assume a uniform level of understanding, even amongst the brightest minds out there.
So if we can't assume everyone thinks like us, how do we apply Krug's like core principle, this "don't make me think"
Mm-hmm.
idea, when we are trying to explain something to someone smart?
Mm-hmm.
It almost feels like overly simplistic. Like, of course you wouldn't want to make someone think.
But that's where the counterintuitive power lies, Krug's first law of usability, which is make things obvious and self-explanatory. It's actually more appreciated by intelligent people, I think, because they recognize the efficiency of it. They don't want to be spending, their precious mental energy trying to decipher what you're saying or how a poorly structured argument works.
Right.
They want to get to the core of the message and then, apply their intellect to analyzing it, questioning it, building upon it.
I love that. It's like respect their mental bandwidth.
Exactly.
Give them the space to actually engage with the meat of the matter.
Right. And Krevig uses, all these examples from websites.
Yeah.
He talks about the frustration of ambiguous button labels, illogical navigation, even these tiny points of confusion. They force the user to pause, to think unnecessarily, like, where do I click? What's going to happen next?
Right.
All these tiny moments of cognitive friction, they add up.
Yeah.
They detract from the overall experience.
And you can see how that immediately translates to explaining complex topics in any context, right?
Yeah.
Using jargon without defining it quickly and clearly, or assuming a shared understanding of these fundamental concepts that might not be universal, or just even presenting information in this disorganized, rambling way.
Mm-hmm.
Even the sharpest mind is going to be like, wait, hold on, I gotta puzzle through this just to figure out what you're even saying,
Okay. And one thing that Krug really hits on that I think is especially true when we're talking about, smart people, is that when they encounter that kind of unnecessary difficulty, that friction, it doesn't just frustrate them, it can actually make them less confident in the presenter and in the information itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. If you make a smart person feel like they're wading through all this complexity for no good reason, they might start to question your own clarity of thought.
Right. Like, if they can't explain it simply, do they even really understand it themselves?
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's not about dumbing things down for a smart audience. It's about efficiency,
Right.
right? It's about respecting their capacity for complex thought by giving them that clear foundation so they can move on to those higher levels of engagement.
Right. Exactly.
Now, Krug also talks about how people actually use the web. And I think this has some surprising implications for how even really smart people process information in general.
Absolutely. He brings up these concepts of scanning, satisficing, and muddling through. And these behaviors, they might seem kind of at odds with this idea of a highly engaged, intelligent mind, but they're actually pretty prevalent even among the smartest people, especially when they're dealing with a ton of information or they're under time constraints.
So scanning, you mean like even someone deeply interested in a topic might not like meticulously read every word of your explanation from start to finish.
Exactly. Krug points out that people are often driven by this desire to find what they need quickly and efficiently. So even a brilliant person who's researching a new area, they might start by scanning multiple sources just to get the lay of the land, looking
Mhm.
for keywords, headings, summaries, things that signal relevance. They're filtering. They
Right.
want to figure out, is this worth my time to really dive into?
Right, right. It's an initial assessment phase.
Exactly.
And then Kirk also talks about satisficing. So that's like choosing the first reasonable option
Yeah.
instead of like exhaustively searching for the absolute best one.
Right. Exactly. We might assume that a really smart person would analyze every possibility, before making a decision or forming an opinion, but in reality, Krug argues, and there's research to back this up, people will often choose the first option that seems good enough, that meets their needs or answers their question adequately.
Right.
They satisfice instead of optimize,
Yeah.
especially when the stakes aren't super high.
That's fascinating. It's like even if a smart person has the capacity to go through every single detail and nuance, they often won't. Especially if that initial information you present is good enough and seems credible.
Yeah.
It puts even more pressure on making sure that those key takeaways are right there,
Yeah.
easily digestible, right?
Absolutely. If those first few sentences they scan don't grab their attention or don't clearly show the relevance to what they're looking for, or if that initial explanation is too convoluted, even a super intelligent, motivated person might just be like, you know what? I'm going to move on. I'm going to find another source that seems more straightforward. You really got to make it easy for them to quickly see the value.
Like with their wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so scanning, satisficing. Now the last one, muddling through, that's an interesting one, especially when we're thinking about, explaining to smart people.
Well, Krug's point is that even people who are technically proficient, really intelligent, often have gaps in their understanding. Like they might be able to use a complex tool really effectively or follow a complex process, but not necessarily understand all the underlying nuts and bolts of how it works. Clear explanations can help prevent that muddling through, give them that solid foundation.
So it's not just about like giving them the answer. It's about giving them that deeper comprehension.
Right.
Okay, so we need to be clear. We need to design for scanning, understand that even smart people satisfice and muddle through sometimes. What are some more practical things that Krug offers that we can use when explaining things to this kind of audience?
One of the big things he talks about is this idea of structure, like really clear structure. And he calls it Billboard Design 101,
Okay.
which is all about, designing for scannability, making sure that the most important information is going to stand out. It's going to be easy to find.
Okay. Like those old Burma shave billboards he talks about, right? Where it's like the message unfolds in these short bursts.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the key principles there are prominence, grouping, and nesting. So prominence, meaning the more important a piece of information is, the more it should visually, or in the case of an explanation, maybe orally or textually, stand out. So
Hmm.
think like bigger font size, bold text, lots of white space in a written document, or even just a change in tone of voice when you're speaking, or putting it right at the beginning.
Right, making it really obvious what the key point is. Okay,
hmm
so prominence. Then grouping and nesting, that's more about showing the relationships between ideas, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Concepts that are logically connected should be presented in a way that visually or structurally reflects that connection. So think about, headings, subheadings, bullet points if you're writing, or clear transitions between topics if you're speaking. These create that hierarchy, that structure that guides the reader or the listener.
Right. It's like giving them like a map to the information.
Exactly.
Okay.
Think about how a well-written academic paper is structured, right? It's got clear sections, it's got subheadings. That allows a knowledgeable reader to just zoom in on the specific information that they need.
So a well-structured explanation, it's almost like it provides the scaffolding, and then the intelligent mind can quickly grasp that overall architecture and then kind of go deeper where they need to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Respecting their ability to handle complex information, but giving them that clear roadmap.
Okay, so clear structure, no unnecessary words. What about navigating through that information? Krug talks about street signs and breadcrumbs on websites. How does that apply when we're, giving a presentation or even just having a conversation where we're trying to explain something?
It's about providing that clear sense of orientation, even when you're dealing with a nonlinear flow of ideas, a complex topic.
hmm
Think about it like helping someone navigate a new city, right? They need those clear street signs so they know where they're going.
Right.
And they need those breadcrumbs so they can retrace their steps if they need to.
Right, right. So like the "you are here" indicator on a map in a shopping mall.
Exactly.
In an explanation, this might mean constantly reminding your audience where you are in the overall structure of the information, how this particular point fits in. Smart people, they want to understand the context. If you're explaining a specific data point, remind them what the overall trend is. If you're talking about one step in a multi-step process, remind them what the ultimate goal is.
Got it, got it. So it's about constantly orienting them within that informational landscape. They never feel lost. They always know how the details connect back to the big picture.
Right.
Now, Krug also talks about conventions, like these familiar patterns. When should we stick to those established norms, and when is it okay to try something new? It's especially when we're communicating with smart people.
He argues that conventions are so valuable because they reduce that cognitive friction. When people encounter familiar patterns, whether it's the layout of a website or the standard structure of a scientific presentation, they don't have to waste time figuring out how things work. They can just dive right in.
Right, right. It's like they already know the grammar, so they can just focus on the content of what you're saying.
Exactly. And he cautions against what he calls gratuitous innovation, like reinventing the wheel just for the sake of being different. Unless there's a clear and significant benefit to doing things differently, a benefit that really improves understanding, it's usually better to stick with what people are familiar with. Smart people can adapt, but if that novelty doesn't add to the clarity or the efficiency, it can actually be frustrating.
Right, right. It's about picking your battles. He even has that wow test.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Like if your new approach doesn't elicit a clear, wow, that's so much better, you're probably better off sticking with the tried and true method.
Exactly.
Okay, so clear structure, no unnecessary words, leverage those conventions. Krug also talks about this really interesting thing, goodwill and respect in the user experience. How does that apply when you're communicating with smart people specifically?
Well, he talks about this idea of a reservoir of goodwill, this idea that every time someone interacts with your website, or in our case, with your explanation, they come to it with a certain amount of trust, a certain positive expectation.
Okay.
But negative experiences can drain that reservoir really quickly.
Right.
Things like hiding important information, forcing users to do things in illogical ways,
Yeah.
asking for information you don't need. Those kinds of things can erode goodwill really fast, especially with an intelligent audience that's going to be more perceptive, more likely to pick up on those things.
Right, right. It's like they're more attuned to those subtle signals of disrespect. And they're also probably going to be more sensitive to like condescending language or
Mhm.
feeling like their time is being wasted with irrelevant stuff.
Exactly.
It's that sense of like, do you even respect my intelligence here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Krug outlines all these things that can actually build goodwill. Things like making important information super easy to find, anticipating their needs, saving them steps, putting in the effort to make the information high quality and well organized, proactively addressing potential questions.
Right. So it's almost like by prioritizing that clarity and that conciseness and that logical structure,
Mhm.
we're not just making the explanation easier to understand. We're actually like actively building goodwill with that smart audience.
Yeah,
We're
absolutely.
showing them that we value their time, we value their intellect.
Exactly. And finally, Krug is a huge advocate for testing your designs, even just informally, to find those areas of confusion and improve the usability.
Mm.
How can we apply that principle to explaining things to smart people?
He really stresses that even a simple informal test, like with just one or two people, can reveal major usability issues on a website. And I think the same is true for explanations, right?
Hmm.
Getting feedback, even if it's just a quick, hey, does this make sense to a colleague or a friend, can really help highlight those areas where our communication might not be as clear as we think it is.
Right.
And the goal isn't to like do a rigorous scientific study every time you're explaining something.
Right.
It's more about like informing your own judgment,
Yeah.
helping you uncover those blind spots.
Yeah.
What seems perfectly clear to us because we've spent all this time thinking about it might not be so obvious to someone coming to it fresh.
Right. And I love that analogy he uses, the cubicle test. Just grab someone nearby and ask them, "Do you get this?"
Mm,
And even if they're not an expert in the topic, if they're struggling, that's a pretty good sign that other people, even smart people, might also have trouble.
right. It helps us avoid that trap of assuming that just because we understand it, everyone else will, especially with those more complex topics.
Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive into explaining things to smart people, drawing on all these principles from Steve Krug, I think the key takeaway is prioritize that absolute clarity, not because your audience lacks intelligence, but because they value efficiency. They value being able to quickly grasp those core concepts. Don't overestimate their prior knowledge. Design your explanations to be easily scannable, using those principles of prominence, grouping, nesting. And remember that even smart people, they satisfice. They don't always do the deep dive.
Right.
Provide a strong structured, well signposted, just like you would with the website. Leave out that unnecessary jargon, the fluff. Provide that constant context so they always know where they are. Use those established conventions whenever it makes sense. And above all, build that goodwill. Demonstrate that respect for their intellect.
And get feedback.
And get feedback.
You know, test your explanations, make sure they're landing the way you intend them to.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. By doing all these things, you're not just making the information accessible, you're empowering those intelligent minds to really engage with your message in a much deeper, much more meaningful way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as you're thinking about this, I'd love for you to consider the last time that you encountered an explanation that really resonated with you, one that helped you understand a complex idea quickly and thoroughly. What made it so effective? What were the key elements?
Right. And on the flip side, when have you, despite being, an intelligent person, struggled to understand something? What were those barriers? What made it difficult?
I think reflecting on those experiences can really help us hone our own communication skills, whether we're writing an email, giving a presentation, or just sharing an idea with a friend.
And we'd love to hear about those experiences, those reflections. Drop us a line. Let us know how you're applying these principles in your own life, your own work.
Absolutely.
This stuff is fascinating.
Yeah. It is. It is. Well, hey, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time.
See ya.